August 18, 1962. Marilyn Monroe stood center stage at the Beverly Hills Hotel's charity gala. 2,000 people in evening wear, flashbulbs popping like gunfire. Then the stiletto came flying through the spotlight. It struck her cheek, drawing blood. The crowd gasped. Marilyn touched the wound, looked straight at publicist Eleanor Kaufman in the wings, and spoke 6 words that would haunt Eleanor for 60 years. "You think this will break me?" What happened next became Hollywood legend. Marilyn finished her performance with blood trickling down her face. She smiled, she bowed, and 3 weeks later she was dead. But Eleanor knew something the world didn't. She knew who threw that shoe. She knew why. And she knew those 6 words weren't defiance. They were a promise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Weight of Secrets. Eleanor Kaufman's arthritic fingers trembled as she turned the key in between the line's front door. 60 years later, and she could still feel the weight of that August night pressing against her chest like a stone. The bookshop's familiar scent of aged paper and lavender should have been comforting, but tonight it felt suffocating. She moved through the darkened aisles, her cane tapping against hardwood floors worn smooth by 3 decades of customers seeking escape in stories. How ironic that she'd built her refuge from the very industry that had made her a monster. No one in Carmel by the Sea knew Eleanor Kaufman had once been Hollywood's most ruthless publicist. To them, she was simply the elderly woman who recommended mysteries and served Earl Grey tea to book club meetings. The lie had protected her. Until today. Eleanor paused beside the biography section, her eyes finding the spine she'd hidden behind a row of Agatha Christie novels. Marilyn, The Final Days by Arthur Miller, Jr. She'd read every book, every article, every conspiracy theory about that night. They all got it wrong. They painted Marilyn as the victim of an unhinged fan, Eleanor as the dedicated publicist who'd tried to protect her client. The truth was far more poisonous. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I have something you need to see. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come alone." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Attached was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, taken from the wings of the Beverly Hills Hotel's ballroom. In it, Eleanor stood beside a young woman with platinum curls, whispering something in her ear. The woman wore a black evening gown and held a stiletto heel in her manicured hand. The woman wasn't Marilyn Monroe. Eleanor's legs gave way, and she gripped the bookshelf for support. After all these years, someone had found proof. Someone knew about Jessica Palmer, the Marilyn look-alike Eleanor had hired. Someone knew the real Marilyn had been drugged in her dressing room, unconscious while her double took the stage. Someone knew Eleanor had orchestrated every detail, the planted fan, the thrown shoe, the public humiliation, all to destroy the woman who'd stolen David's heart. She stumbled to her office in the back of the shop, past the cozy reading nook where Mrs. Henderson held her Thursday poetry circle, past the children's corner with its cheerful yellow walls. This normal life, this carefully constructed peace, was about to crumble. Eleanor sank into her desk chair and opened the bottom drawer with shaking hands. Beneath tax records and inventory sheets lay a manila envelope she hadn't touched in decades. Inside, a single photograph, Marilyn and David Grayson at Chasen's restaurant, his hand covering hers across the white tablecloth. Eleanor had taken the picture herself, hired a photographer to document their affair. She'd planned to use it for leverage, but David had chosen Marilyn anyway. "I love her, Ellie," he'd said in his apartment that night, his voice gentle but final. "I'm leaving Patricia. Marilyn and I are going to disappear together after the charity gala." Eleanor had smiled and congratulated him, played the loyal friend. Inside, she'd been calculating. If she couldn't have David, she'd make sure Marilyn couldn't either. The plan had been perfect. Humiliate Marilyn publicly, plant drugs in her dressing room, leak the story to the tabloids. David would see her as damaged goods, unstable. He'd come back to Eleanor, grateful for her steady presence. Except Marilyn hadn't broken. Even drugged, even bleeding, even knowing she'd been betrayed, she'd looked Eleanor dead in the eye and delivered those 6 words with surgical precision. You think this will break me? Not a question. A declaration of war. 3 weeks later, Marilyn was found dead in her Brentwood home. The world called it suicide, but Eleanor knew better. Marilyn Monroe was many things, but she wasn't a quitter. She'd been planning something. Those final weeks, she'd been making calls, meeting with lawyers, gathering evidence. Eleanor had fled Hollywood within days of the funeral, changed her name, buried her past. She'd told herself Marilyn's death was coincidence, that her own paranoia was making connections that didn't exist. But what if she'd been wrong? What if Marilyn had survived? What if the body in that coffin had been someone else? Perhaps a look-alike who knew too much. Eleanor's phone buzzed again. Another message. She says hello. The photograph attachment made Eleanor's vision blur. It showed an elderly woman in a wide-brimmed hat and oversized sunglasses, standing across the street from between the lines. The woman's face was partially obscured, but her posture was unmistakable. The way she held her shoulders, the tilt of her head, the elegant curve of her neck. Eleanor had spent 2 years studying every detail of Marilyn Monroe's body language for publicity shoots. She'd know that silhouette anywhere. 30 years of hiding were about to end. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Eleanor would finally face the woman she'd tried to destroy. The woman who'd apparently been watching her all along. Now the real performance was about to begin, and this time, Eleanor wasn't directing the show. The sanctuary. Eleanor dropped the phone as if it had burned her fingers. The device clattered against the hardwood floor of her office, the screen flickering once before going dark. In the sudden silence, she could hear her own ragged breathing and the distant crash of waves against Carmel's rocky shore. A sound that had soothed her for 3 decades but now felt ominous, like the ocean itself was whispering secrets. She pressed her palms against her desk, feeling the familiar grain of the oak wood beneath her fingers. This desk had been David's once, rescued from an estate sale in Pacific Grove during her 3rd year in exile. She'd told herself it was merely practical, a good piece of furniture at a reasonable price. But late at night, when the bookshop was empty and her defenses were down, she'd run her hands across its surface and remember how David used to tap his fingers against his own desk when he was thinking, planning their next publicity campaign or considering which starlet deserved his attention. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd destroyed Marilyn to keep David, and lost him anyway. He'd married Patricia Whitmore 6 months after the funeral, fled to Europe to make art films that nobody watched. Eleanor had monitored his career from afar for years, a masochistic ritual that served as both punishment and proof that her sacrifice had been worthless. Outside, a car door slammed. Eleanor's pulse spiked until she heard Mrs. Chen's familiar voice calling goodnight to her grandson. Tuesday evening. Tommy always drove his grandmother home from her shift at the antique shop next door. Normal life, continuing its predictable rhythm while Eleanor's world tilted toward chaos. She forced herself to stand, retrieving the phone with trembling fingers. The photograph was still there, that elegant silhouette, poised and patient as a predator. How long had she been watched? How many of Eleanor's quiet moments had been observed and catalogued? The morning walks to Carmel Beach, the Saturday afternoons at the farmer's market, the Sunday dinners with her neighbor Claire. Had they all been performances for an audience of one? Eleanor moved through the bookshop like a sleepwalker, touching the spines of beloved volumes that suddenly felt like props in an elaborate stage set. Here was the mystery section where she'd spent countless hours, losing herself in other people's carefully plotted deceptions. There, the romance novels she'd secretly devoured, their happy endings of fantasy she'd forfeited the right to believe in. And everywhere, the customers who'd become her surrogate family, people who knew nothing of Eleanor's capacity for destruction. She paused at the community bulletin board near the front window, studying the familiar postings, Claire's yoga classes, book club announcements, a lost cat named Whiskers. These fragments of ordinary life suddenly felt precious and fragile, like soap bubbles that would burst at the slightest touch. Eleanor's reflection caught her eye in the window glass, a small, silver-haired woman who looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a retired shopkeeper, harmless and forgettable. She'd cultivated this appearance deliberately, traded her Hollywood glamour for cardigans and sensible shoes, became someone who wouldn't warrant a second glance, the perfect disguise for a woman with blood on her hands. Behind her reflection, the street lay quiet under the amber glow of Victorian-style lampposts. Every shadow could hide a watcher. Every parked car could contain an enemy. Eleanor had lived without paranoia for so long that its return felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit, constraining and uncomfortable, but undeniably familiar. She thought of her morning routine, the ritual that had anchored her for 3 decades. Coffee brewed in the same ceramic pot, newspapers read in the same order, flowers arranged in the same blue vase. Tomorrow, she would perform these actions knowing they might be the last time. The thought made her chest tight, with an unexpected grief. Her phone buzzed again, a sound that now carried the weight of an execution bell. This time, no message, just a photograph of her own front door taken from across the street. The timestamp showed today, 3:47 p.m. Eleanor had been shelving returns then, her back to the window, blissfully unaware that her sanctuary had already been breached. The image included something else that made her knees weak, a glimpse of shadow in the doorway, a suggestion of movement that spoke of practiced surveillance. Professional, patient, Marilyn, if it was truly Marilyn, had learned new skills in the years since her supposed death. Or perhaps she'd always possessed them, hidden beneath the breathless vulnerability that had made her America's sweetheart. Eleanor sank into the reading chair by the poetry section, the same chair where she'd held story time for dozens of children over the years. Their faces flashed through her memory, bright eyes and gap-toothed grins, innocence she'd treasured because it reminded her that not everyone was capable of the darkness she'd embraced. What would happen to them when her secret was revealed? Would their parents trust their children to a woman who'd orchestrated the destruction of an icon? The bookshop's grandfather clock chimed 9 times, each note resonating through the silence like a countdown. 13 hours until the meeting. 13 hours until her carefully constructed life either shattered completely or revealed itself to have been an illusion all along. Outside, fog began to roll in from the Pacific, wrapping Carmel by the sea in its familiar embrace. Eleanor watched it swallow the streetlights one by one, and wondered if she was witnessing her last peaceful evening, or if peace had always been beyond her reach. The visitor. The fog had thickened to an impenetrable wall when the knock came at her front door. 3 soft raps, almost polite. Eleanor's blood froze in her veins as she sat motionless in the poetry chair, praying the sound had been her imagination. The grandfather clock's pendulum seemed to mock her with its steady rhythm, tick, tock, tick, counting down moments she no longer had. Another knock, more insistent this time. Eleanor's arthritic fingers gripped the chair's worn armrests. No one visited at 10:15 on a Tuesday night. Claire always called first. The postal service didn't deliver this late. Even drunk tourists knew better than to wander the residential streets after dark when the fog rolled in like a living thing. But someone was here. Someone who knew exactly where to find her. She forced herself to stand, her cane forgotten as she moved through the darkened bookshop with the fluid silence of a much younger woman. 30 years of peaceful retirement hadn't entirely erased the predatory grace she'd once wielded in Hollywood boardrooms. Some skills, once learned, lived in the bones forever. The knock came again, 3 measured beats that somehow conveyed infinite patience. Whoever stood on her threshold could wait all night if necessary. They had traveled 60 years to reach this moment. A few more hours meant nothing. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall beside the front window, angling her head to glimpse the porch through a gap in the curtains. The fog had transformed her familiar street into an alien landscape, but she could make out a figure standing beneath her porch light. Tall, slender, wearing what appeared to be a vintage coat that belonged to another decade. The wide-brimmed hat and oversized sunglasses from the photograph were gone, revealing silver hair styled in a manner that made Eleanor's chest constrict with recognition. Even at 75, even weathered by decades of hiding, the bone structure was unmistakable. The delicate jawline, the elegant neck, the way she held her shoulders, proud despite everything, unbroken despite what had been done to her. Norma Jean Baker stood on Eleanor's porch like a ghost made flesh. "I know you're watching, Eleanor." The voice drifted through the glass, soft but clear, still recognizable despite the years, though something had changed in its cadence. The breathless vulnerability was gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "We have things to discuss," Eleanor's legs nearly buckled. Hearing that voice again, the same voice that had whispered those 6 words 60 years ago, felt like being struck by lightning. She pressed her palm against her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. "I've waited so long for this moment," Marilyn continued, her tone conversational, almost fond. 30 years I've been watching you build this lovely little life. The bookshop, the story times, the quiet respectability. You play the role of the harmless old woman beautifully. Almost as convincing as my own death, don't you think?" The words carried no anger, which somehow made them infinitely more terrifying. This wasn't the heated confrontation Eleanor had expected. This was something colder, more calculated. This was a predator who had spent decades planning the perfect revenge. Eleanor found her voice, though it came out as a croak. "What do you want?" A soft laugh drifted through the glass, warm, genuine, and utterly chilling. "Oh, darling, that's not the right question. The question is, what did you think would happen when you tried to destroy someone who had nothing left to lose?" Through the curtain gap, Eleanor watched as Marilyn reached into her vintage purse and withdrew something small and dark, a key. She held it up to the light, letting Eleanor see it clearly. "I've had this made specially," Marilyn said, as if sharing a delightful secret. "Locksmiths are so helpful when you tell them you're locked out of your own home, especially when you look like a harmless elderly lady who just wants to water her neighbor's plants." Eleanor's mouth went dry. "You can't?" "Can't what? Break into your sanctuary? Disrupt your peace?" The laugh came again, musical and terrible. "Eleanor, sweet Eleanor, you wrote the playbook on destroying someone's safe spaces. I'm simply returning the favor." The sound of the key sliding into the lock was impossibly loud in the fog-muffled night. Eleanor heard the tumblers turn with mechanical precision, the same sound that had welcomed her home thousands of times now marking the end of her refuge. The door opened with a whisper, and Marilyn Monroe stepped into the bookshop that had been Eleanor's fortress for 3 decades. She moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in the dark, as if she'd walked these aisles before. Which, Eleanor realized with growing horror, she probably had. "Hello, Eleanor," Marilyn said, her voice carrying clearly through the shop's hushed atmosphere. "I believe we have unfinished business." Eleanor remained frozen against the wall, watching as the woman she'd tried to obliterate surveyed the life she'd built from the ashes of her shame. This was the moment she'd been running from since 1962, the reckoning she'd always known would come. Her sanctuary had fallen without a single shot fired. Eleanor's mind recoiled from the impossibility standing in her bookshop. This had to be a nightmare, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by the documentary footage and anonymous messages. Dead people didn't break into bookshops. Dead people didn't age gracefully into silver-haired elegance. Dead people certainly didn't spend 30 years planning revenge. "You're not real," Eleanor whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Marilyn tilted her head with that familiar gesture Eleanor remembered from 1,000 publicity photos. "Oh, but I am. More real than I've been allowed to be since 1962. She moved deeper into the shop, her fingers trailing along book spines with casual intimacy. "You have excellent taste, Eleanor, though I notice you don't carry any books about Hollywood. Guilty conscience?" Eleanor pressed herself harder against the wall, as if she could merge with the plaster and disappear entirely. "The world saw your funeral. The whole world mourned you. The world saw what it needed to see." Marilyn paused at the mystery section, pulling out a Raymond Chandler novel and examining its cover with genuine interest. Amazing how easily people accept a narrative when it's presented properly. "You taught me that. Your little scheme in 62 was quite the masterclass in manipulation." The casual tone, devoid of hysteria or rage, terrified Eleanor more than screaming would have. This wasn't a woman driven by emotion. This was someone who had spent decades learning patience, planning, waiting for precisely the right moment to strike. "But you were found dead," Eleanor stammered. "The coroner, the autopsy." "Money can buy remarkable things, including silence." Marilyn replaced the book with careful precision, as if she were a customer browsing rather than a ghost demolishing someone's sanity. "Did you know there are people who specialize in helping inconvenient individuals disappear?" particularly when those individuals have accumulated dangerous information about dangerous people? Eleanor's legs gave way entirely. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor like a discarded doll, her carefully maintained dignity crumbling. This isn't possible. You drugged me that night, left me unconscious while your little actress played her role. Marilyn's voice remained conversational, but something sharp entered her tone. When I woke up, bleeding in my dressing room with photographers pounding on the door, I realized how thoroughly you'd outplayed me. The planted evidence, the staged humiliation, the character assassination already spreading through the newspapers by morning. Brilliant, really. Ruthless, but brilliant. She moved to Eleanor's desk, running her fingers across the oak surface with knowing familiarity. David's desk, isn't it? I remember him mentioning it. He had such elegant hands, perfect for a man who created beautiful things. Her smile was knife-sharp. Pity how he ended up. All those failed European films, the drinking, the way he died alone in that Rome hotel room. But you knew about that, didn't you? You kept track. The casual cruelty of the revelation, that she knew about Eleanor's obsessive monitoring of David's decline, made Eleanor's vision blur. Why? Why wait so long? Because quick revenge is for amateurs. Marilyn opened Eleanor's desk drawers with the confidence of someone who had done this before, examining the contents like an appraiser evaluating estate goods. I wanted you to build something meaningful, create a life worth destroying. You can't truly hurt someone who has nothing to lose. I should know. Eleanor watched in numb horror as Marilyn found the manila envelope in the bottom drawer, the one containing David and Marilyn's photograph. She opened it without hesitation, studying the image of her younger self with detached interest. I'd forgotten how young I looked then, how hopeful. She showed Eleanor the photograph. David took me to Chasen's that night to propose. Did you know that? He'd left Patricia, bought a ring, planned our whole future together. We were going to disappear after the charity gala, start over somewhere quiet. Maybe a place like this. The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She'd never known about the proposal, had never imagined David's feelings ran that deep. She'd destroyed something real, not just a Hollywood fling. The best part, Marilyn continued, settling into Eleanor's desk chair as if she owned it, was watching you build this perfect little sanctuary. The story times with children who adore you, the customers who trust you, the neighbors who invite you for Sunday dinner. You created exactly what I lost. A place where someone could be loved for who they pretended to be rather than what they'd done. Eleanor tried to speak, to apologize, to beg, but Marilyn held up one elegant hand. Save your words. We have time for proper conversation later. Right now, I want you to understand something important. She leaned forward, her aged face suddenly terrible in its serene certainty. Everything you've built here, everyone you've grown to love, it's all about to learn exactly who Eleanor Kaufman really is. And unlike my death, this revelation will be entirely, devastatingly real. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sound of foghorns from the bay. Eleanor remained crumpled on the floor, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what Marilyn had just revealed. The children who gathered weekly for story time, their bright faces and trusting eyes. Claire, who brought soup when Eleanor caught cold, who shared Christmas morning coffee and Easter brunches. The customers who confided, their reading preferences, their small joys and sorrows, treating her like the grandmother many had never known. All of it built on a lie, all of it about to crumble. You see it now, Marilyn observed, her voice gentle with mock sympathy. That sick feeling in your stomach? That's what I felt watching the newspapers tear me apart the morning after the gala. Except you had somewhere to run. I had nowhere left to hide. Eleanor forced herself to speak, though her voice came out broken. How long have you been watching? Oh, darling. I've been watching since the beginning. Marilyn rose from the desk chair, moving to the window where she adjusted the curtains with proprietary ease. Did you really think you could disappear into small-town anonymity without leaving a trail? I found you within 6 months of your relocation. You were so proud of your new identity, your careful transformation from Hollywood shark to literary spinster. The revelation hit Eleanor like ice water. Everything, her morning walks, Her quiet dinners, her Sunday conversations with Claire, all of it had been observed, catalogued, weaponized. She'd been living in a fishbowl for 30 years without knowing it. The documentary filmmaker, Eleanor whispered, the pieces clicking into place. You sent him. Marilyn's smile was radiant and terrible. Marcus Chen, such a dedicated young man, so eager to uncover the truth about that tragic night in 1962. I simply provided him with the right materials, pointed him in the proper direction. Amazing how easily investigative journalism can be guided when you know which stones to suggest they look under. Eleanor's chest tightened as she understood the full scope of the trap. The footage shows exactly what I want it to show. You, orchestrating my humiliation with such meticulous precision. The stage distraction, the planted evidence, the actress you hired to play the crazed fan, all captured in beautiful black and white detail. Marilyn moved to the biography section, her fingers finding a volume about old Hollywood with unerring accuracy. Technology is remarkable these days. Young Marcus will soon discover additional footage that didn't make it into his initial cut. Footage that shows your face quite clearly as you coordinate my destruction. The bookshop felt like it was shrinking around Eleanor, the familiar walls closing in to form a coffin. No one will believe it. The statute of limitations. This isn't about legal consequences, Eleanor. This is about truth. Marilyn opened the Hollywood biography, revealing photographs of stars from the Golden Age. She paused at a picture of herself, young, luminous, untouchable in her fame. Legal justice is for people who trust the system. I learned better than that 60 years ago. Eleanor struggled to her feet, using the wall for support. Her legs felt like water, but she needed to stand, to face this reckoning on her feet rather than cowering like a child. What do you want from me? I want you to remember what you destroyed. Marilyn closed the book with a soft snap. Not just my career or my reputation, though those were considerable losses. I want you to remember the life you killed that night, the future you stole. She moved to the children's section, her aged hands touching the small chairs where Eleanor's young listeners gathered each Saturday morning. I would have been a mother. David and I had talked about it. 3 children, maybe 4. A house in the Hollywood Hills with a garden where I could grow roses. Quiet Sunday mornings reading the papers. Birthday parties with homemade cake instead of studio photographers. Eleanor's throat burned with unshed tears. I didn't know. You didn't care to know. The words cut like surgical instruments. You saw what threatened you and eliminated it without considering the collateral damage. Just like every other Hollywood predator who justified cruelty as business necessity. Marilyn turned from the children's section, her eyes holding Eleanor with the weight of decades of planning. Tomorrow, that documentary will screen at the Carmel Film Festival, a surprise addition to the schedule. The festival director was so excited to premiere never-before-seen footage of Hollywood's greatest tragedy. Your neighbors will be in the audience, your customers. Claire, who thinks of you as the sister she never had. Eleanor's world tilted violently. The film festival, she'd planned to attend, had been looking forward to it for weeks. You can't. I can. I will. And you'll be there to watch it all unfold. Marilyn moved toward the door, her purpose accomplished, her trap perfectly set. Because if you're not in that audience when the lights come up, I'll make sure your disappearance becomes front-page news. The mysterious vanishing of Eleanor Kaufman and the investigation that follows will uncover so much more than my little documentary ever could. Eleanor stood frozen as Marilyn paused in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the fog-shrouded night. Sleep well, Eleanor. Tomorrow, you finally pay for what you destroyed. The door closed with a whisper, leaving Eleanor alone with the ruins of her carefully constructed peace. Eleanor stood motionless in the suffocating silence, her sanctuary transformed into a mausoleum of shattered illusions. The familiar scent of old books and lavender now seemed cloying, artificial, like everything else about her carefully constructed existence. She moved toward her desk on unsteady legs, each step echoing in the emptiness Marilyn had left behind. The manila envelope lay open where Marilyn had abandoned it, David's photograph face up under the lamplight. Eleanor sank into her chair, the chair where Marilyn had sat with such casual ownership and stared at the image that had haunted her for 3 decades. But now, looking at their intertwined hands, their matching expressions of quiet joy, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice: the ring on Marilyn's finger. How had she never noticed it before? Eleanor grabbed the magnifying glass she used for examining rare book conditions and held it over the photograph. There, unmistakable in the black and white clarity, was an engagement ring on Marilyn's left hand. Not the costume jewelry she wore for publicity shots, but something delicate and real, a vintage setting with what looked like David's grandmother's diamond, the one he'd described to Eleanor during their own brief affair. The photograph wasn't from some casual dinner date. It was an engagement celebration. Eleanor's hands began to tremble as the implications crashed over her. Marilyn hadn't been lying about the proposal. She'd been wearing David's ring the entire night of the charity gala, which meant when Eleanor had orchestrated the humiliation, when she'd destroyed Marilyn's reputation and sent her fleeing into hiding, she hadn't just been eliminating a rival, she'd been destroying David's fiancée. The memory of that night shifted like fragments in a kaleidoscope, revealing new patterns that made Eleanor's chest constrict with horror. David's distraction during the gala, the way he'd kept checking his watch, his insistence on leaving early. He hadn't been bored by the charity event. He'd been nervous about the proposal he'd already made, eager to begin their new life together. Eleanor stumbled to the filing cabinet where she kept her most private papers, her fingers fumbling with keys that felt foreign in her shaking hands. In the bottom drawer, beneath insurance policies and property deeds, lay the collection of newspaper clippings she'd saved from 1962. Not just the reviews of the charity gala, but everything that followed. The headlines screamed their accusations. Monroe's mental breakdown caught on film. Hollywood's sweetheart revealed as unstable diva. Witnesses report bizarre behavior before shocking meltdown. But now Eleanor saw what she'd been too consumed with victory to notice at the time. In the smaller articles, buried beneath the sensational coverage, were quotes from David. Not the dismissive comments Eleanor had expected from a man embarrassed by his lover's public humiliation, but the desperate words of someone trying to defend the woman he loved. Marilyn was set up, he'd told one persistent reporter. Someone orchestrated this. She would never behave that way. I know who's behind this, he'd said to another. Eleanor Kaufman has been gunning for Marilyn since the studio assigned me to her picture. This has her fingerprints all over it. Eleanor's vision blurred as she read quotes she'd forgotten, accusations she'd dismissed as the ravings of a man too besotted to see clearly. But David hadn't been blinded by love. He'd been the only one seeing clearly. He'd known exactly who had destroyed his future, and Eleanor had been too arrogant to realize the danger. She flipped through more clippings, her movements growing frantic as she searched for something that would make sense of the timeline. David had left for Europe 3 weeks after the gala, but the article suggested he'd spent those weeks trying to find Marilyn, hiring private investigators, following leads that went nowhere. He hadn't abandoned his fiancée. He'd been searching for her. And when that search failed, when the trail went cold and the woman he loved vanished into whatever elaborate disappearance she'd arranged, David had broken entirely. The drinking, the failed films, the slow deterioration that led to his lonely death in Rome, it hadn't been the natural decline of a fading talent. It had been suicide in slow motion. Eleanor dropped the clippings, her hands flying to her mouth as the final piece fell into place. She'd killed David just as surely as if she'd put a gun to his head, not quickly, but slowly, methodically, by destroying the one thing that gave his life meaning. The woman who'd stood in her bookshop tonight, with her silver hair and careful composure, wasn't just seeking revenge for her own losses. She was seeking justice for the man they'd both loved, the man Eleanor's jealousy had driven to despair and death. "Oh, God," Eleanor whispered to the empty shop. "What have I done?" But even as the words left her lips, she knew the answer. She'd been telling herself lies for 60 years, crafting a narrative where she was the victim of circumstance rather than the architect of tragedy. Tomorrow, when that documentary played and her neighbors learned the truth, they wouldn't just be discovering that Eleanor Kaufman was a fraud. They'd be learning she was a murderer. Eleanor remained frozen among the scattered newspaper clippings, her confession hanging in the stale air like incense at a funeral. The word murderer echoed in her mind, each repetition driving the truth deeper into her consciousness. She had killed David, not with poison or a blade, but with something far more insidious, the systematic destruction of hope itself. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight, its resonant notes marking the transition into what would be her final day of anonymity. In less than 18 hours, Marcus Chen's documentary would flicker to life on the festival screen, and Eleanor Kaufman, beloved bookshop owner, trusted confidant, surrogate grandmother, would cease to exist. She forced herself to stand, her body moving with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. The bookshop stretched around her like a crime scene, every corner holding evidence of the life she was about to lose. The reading nook where Mrs. Patterson shared gossip over tea. The children's corner where little Tommy had taken his first halting steps through green eggs and ham. The poetry section where she and Claire had spent countless evenings debating Dickinson versus Plath. All of it contaminated now by the truth. Eleanor walked to her desk phone, her fingers hovering over the receiver. She could call Claire, try to explain before tomorrow's revelation made explanation impossible. But what words existed for such a confession? "I'm sorry, but I need to tell you that I destroyed an innocent woman's life out of jealousy 60 years ago, and now I'm about to be exposed as a fraud and a murderer." The phone remained silent in its cradle. She moved to the front window instead, peering through the curtains at the fog-shrouded street. Carmel by the sea slept peacefully, its fairy-tale cottages and winding lanes holding no hint of the earthquake about to shatter its quiet rhythms. In 12 hours, these same streets would buzz with whispered conversations as her neighbors processed what they'd learned about the woman they'd trusted with their secrets. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass, remembering the morning she'd first walked these streets 30 years ago. She'd chosen Carmel deliberately, a place where literary eccentricity was not just tolerated but celebrated, where a woman with a mysterious past could reinvent herself as a keeper of stories rather than a destroyer of lives. She'd studied the town's rhythms like a method actor preparing for the role of a lifetime. And it had been a performance, hadn't it? Every kind gesture, every charitable donation, every patient hour spent with struggling readers, all of it an elaborate costume designed to hide the monster underneath. Even her genuine affection for Claire, her protective instincts toward the children who gathered for story time, her satisfaction in matching readers with perfect books. Were these real emotions, or simply the actress's commitment to character? The uncertainty terrified her more than tomorrow's exposure. If 60 years of decent behavior could be reduced to mere performance, what did that make her? Was there anything authentic left beneath the layers of constructed identity? Eleanor returned to her desk and opened the bottom drawer again, this time retrieving the leather journal she'd kept hidden beneath the manila envelope. Its pages contained 30 years of careful documentation, every kindness received, every friendship forged, every moment of genuine happiness in her adopted life. She'd written in it religiously, as if recording these experiences could somehow make them more real, more deserving of preservation. Now the journal felt like evidence for a defense attorney. Look, she could argue, see how much good I've done? See how I've changed? But even as she flipped through pages of charity work and community involvement, Eleanor knew the futility of such arguments. A murderer who spent decades volunteering at orphanages was still a murderer. The scales of justice didn't balance that way. She thought of Marilyn, somewhere in the fog-wrapped night, preparing for her moment of triumph. Did she sleep peacefully, knowing that 60 years of patient planning were about to reach fruition? Or did she lie awake, savoring the anticipation of watching Eleanor's world collapse in real time? Eleanor understood now why Marilyn had insisted she attend the screening. This wasn't just about public exposure. It was about forcing Eleanor to witness the exact moment when everyone she cared about learned the truth, to see the recognition dawn in Claire's eyes, the horrified understanding spread across familiar faces, the instinctive step backward that people took when they realized they'd been harboring a monster. The cruelest part was that Marilyn was giving her a choice. Eleanor could run, pack her car and disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, abandoning everything but preserving some shred of dignity. But the threat was clear: disappear now, and the investigation that followed would uncover far worse than a documentary ever could. Forensic accountants would trace her money, digital archaeologists would reconstruct her past. The full scope of her deception would become public record rather than private revelation. No. Tomorrow's screening wasn't really a choice at all. It was an execution scheduled for 7 p.m., with Eleanor Kaufman as both the condemned and the star witness to her own destruction. She closed the journal and placed it back in the drawer, then sat quietly in the darkness, waiting for dawn to begin her final day of being someone she'd never really been. Climax. The pale light of dawn filtered through the bookshop windows, finding Eleanor exactly where midnight had left her, motionless at her desk, staring at the photograph of David and Marilyn with the hollow-eyed intensity of someone who had finally run out of places to hide from the truth. She had not slept, could not sleep. The hours between midnight and sunrise had passed in a strange suspended animation, her mind cycling endlessly through the same impossible calculations. How many ways could she frame her confession? How many words existed to explain the unexplainable? How did someone apologize for destroying 2 lives and then building a new identity on the foundation of their graves? The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, marking the beginning of her final day as Eleanor Kaufman, beloved bookseller. In 12 hours, Marcus Chen's documentary would transform her from trusted community member to cautionary tale. But sitting in the growing light, Eleanor realized that waiting for evening had become unbearable. The execution might be scheduled for 7 p.m., but she was already dying by degrees with each passing minute. She stood abruptly, her decision crystallizing with startling clarity. If she was going to be destroyed, let it happen on her terms rather than Marilyn's carefully orchestrated timeline. Let her choose the moment of impact, instead of cowering like a condemned prisoner counting down to the inevitable. Eleanor retrieved her coat from behind the counter and walked to the front door, her movements steady despite the tremor in her hands. The fog hung heavy over the sleeping village, muffling her footsteps as she made her way down Ocean Avenue toward the address she'd memorized from the festival registration forms. Marcus Chen was staying at the Pine Inn, 3 blocks from her shop, probably sleeping peacefully beside his laptop full of damning evidence. The hotel lobby was deserted except for a drowsy desk clerk who barely glanced up as Eleanor approached. "I need to speak with Marcus Chen," she said quietly. "It's about the documentary screening tonight." The clerk consulted his computer with obvious reluctance. "It's pretty early, Ma. Couldn't this wait until—" "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that surprised them both. "It cannot wait. Please call his room and tell him Eleanor Kaufman needs to speak with him immediately. He'll understand the urgency." 5 minutes later, Marcus appeared in the lobby wearing hastily pulled-on clothes and an expression of confused alertness. Eleanor had seen him around town during his research visits, this earnest young man with his digital recorder and careful questions, but they had never spoken directly. Now, studying his face in the harsh fluorescent light, she could see the intelligence behind his eyes, the same keen perception that had made him the perfect instrument for Marilyn's revenge. "Miss Kaufman," he said cautiously, "this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" Eleanor looked at this young man who had unwittingly become her executioner, this dedicated journalist who believed he was serving truth when he was actually serving calculated vengeance. The irony might have been amusing if it weren't so devastating. "Mr. Chen," she said steadily, "I understand you have footage that implicates me in what happened to Marilyn Monroe 60 years ago." His face went carefully blank, the practiced neutrality of a reporter protecting his sources. "I'm not sure what you—" "The woman who provided you with that footage," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The one who guided your investigation and pointed you toward the right evidence. Did she give you a name?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding the full scope of Marilyn's orchestration. Of course she hadn't revealed herself to the young filmmaker. Better to remain the mysterious source, the anonymous guardian of historical truth. Let Marcus believe he had uncovered the story through his own investigative brilliance. "She's not anonymous," Eleanor said quietly. "She's the woman I destroyed in 1962, Marilyn Monroe, very much alive and very committed to finishing what she started 60 years ago." The words hung between them like a confession shouted in an empty cathedral. Marcus stared at her with the expression of someone watching reality rearrange itself in real time, his journalist's instincts warring with the impossibility of what he was hearing. "That's," he began, then stopped, his mind clearly racing through implications and impossibilities. "She died. The official records show exactly what she wanted them to show," Eleanor finished. "Just like your documentary shows exactly what she wants it to show. We've both been playing roles in her carefully scripted revenge, Mr. Chen. The only difference is that I finally understand what's happening." She sat heavily in one of the lobby's overstuffed chairs, the weight of 60 years suddenly pressing down on her shoulders. "The question now is what you're going to do with that knowledge. Tonight's screening will destroy my life regardless. But you have the power to choose whether you're a journalist serving truth or a weapon serving vengeance." Marcus remained standing, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and the growing recognition that his greatest story had just become infinitely more complicated. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his coffee-stained shirt and disheveled hair making him look younger than his 35 years. Eleanor watched the journalist's mind work, seeing the precise moment when professional skepticism gave way to horrified understanding. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "then I've been—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would make him complicit in something far more complex than documentary filmmaking. "You've been used," Eleanor completed gently. "As have I. The difference is that I deserved it." Marcus sank into the chair across from her, his hands running through his already mussed hair. "This is insane. People don't just fake their deaths and spend 60 years plotting revenge. This isn't a movie, Miss Kaufman." "Isn't it?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "We're all just playing our assigned roles, Mr. Chen. You're the crusading journalist uncovering buried truth. I'm the villain finally exposed for her crimes. And she—" Eleanor paused, feeling the weight of Marilyn's orchestration like a physical presence in the room. "She's the wronged woman finally getting justice." It's actually quite elegant storytelling. The lobby's grandfather clock chimed 8 times, each note echoing off the empty walls. Eleanor realized she felt lighter somehow, as if confession had lifted a burden she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its weight. For 30 years, she'd lived in constant fear of discovery. Now that discovery was imminent, the anticipation was almost worse than the reality would be. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked finally. Eleanor considered the question. What did she want? To be forgiven? Impossible. To have her good deeds of the past 30 years somehow balance the scales? Equally impossible. To disappear before tonight's reckoning? Tempting but ultimately cowardly. "I want you to understand that whatever footage you have, whatever evidence she provided, it tells only part of the story," Eleanor said. "Yes, I orchestrated Marilyn's humiliation that night. Yes, I destroyed her career and drove her into hiding. But I also destroyed the man we both loved, and I've spent every day since trying to become someone worthy of the kindness this community has shown me." Marcus leaned forward, his journalist's instincts finally overriding his shock. "You're asking me to humanize you, to present you as more than just the villain in her story." "I'm asking you to tell the complete truth," Eleanor corrected. "If you're going to destroy my life tonight, and you are, then at least let it be in service of actual journalism rather than elaborate revenge theater." They sat in silence as the hotel slowly awakened around them. Early guests rustled past toward the breakfast room, their quiet conversations a reminder of the normal world that would soon be closed to Eleanor forever. She thought of her bookshop, probably already receiving its first curious visitors drawn by rumors of tonight's documentary. By tomorrow, it would be a tourist attraction, the former business of the woman who destroyed Marilyn Monroe. "She gave me everything," Marcus said suddenly. "Phone records, witness statements, financial documents proving you had access to the charity gala's security arrangements. Even footage from that night that's never been seen publicly. It was the most complete source package I've ever received." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Marilyn would have been meticulous, spending decades collecting evidence like a prosecutor building an airtight case. No detail left to chance, no avenue of escape unconsidered. "And now?" Eleanor asked. Marcus stood, pacing to the lobby windows where morning fog still obscured the street. Now I have 12 hours to decide whether to screen a documentary that will destroy an elderly woman's life, or to cancel the most important film of my career, because it might be serving someone else's agenda. The film will screen, Eleanor said with quiet certainty. If you cancel it, she'll simply find another way to reveal the truth. Better that it happened through your careful journalism than through some cruder exposure. She rose from her chair, feeling oddly peaceful. The waiting was nearly over. In a few hours, she would walk into that screening room and watch her carefully constructed life dissolve on screen. She would see her neighbors' faces change as they learned who she really was. She would lose everything she'd built over 3 decades of patient reinvention. And perhaps, finally, she would stop running from 1962. "Mr. Chen," she said, pausing at the lobby door, "when you tell this story, the complete story, remember that some acts of cruelty echo for 60 years. But also remember that the people we choose to become in response to our worst moments, that matters too." She left him standing by the windows, staring out at the fog-wrapped village where her final day was beginning. There were people to see, goodbyes to prepare, and a lifetime of lies to finally set aside. Eleanor Kaufman had 12 hours left to be someone she'd never really been. She intended to use them well.